Hello everyone and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm going to be analysing the opening lines of Virginia Woolf's classic seminal text, A Room of One's Own, often held up as an iconic feminist tract of the modernist period. And in it, Virginia Woolf examines the topic of women, gender and fiction, and considers the history of women's writing. Indeed, A Room of One's Own is arguably the first critical literary history of women writers. I'm going to be analysing and close reading the opening line of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own because I think it reveals a great deal in only one sentence about Virginia Woolf's purposes within the main body of the text. And I'll quickly run through, take a very brief quick look at the arguments within the main body of the text in the second half of this video. I want to think about the way in which Virginia Woolf sets up the relationship between the speaking voice and the reader in the opening sentence of A Room of One's Own. Before I forget, do subscribe to my channel so you'll see my new videos when they're uploaded weekly, and like the video by pressing the thumbs up. It really does help me out in YouTube's algorithm so that more people will be able to see my videos. In October 1928, Virginia Woolf had given lectures on women and fiction at the two women's colleges at the University of Cambridge. That's Girton College and Newnham College. It should be remembered that it was only in 1923, a mere 5 years before Virginia Woolf's lectures, that women had been permitted to receive degrees at all from Cambridge University. So on the right there is a woman called Philippa Fawcett, and in 1890 she was placed above the senior wrangler. So the senior wrangler is the name that's given to the top mathematics undergraduate in the whole of Cambridge University. She received marks higher than the senior wrangler, but because she was a woman, she couldn't be the senior wrangler, so they had to give her her own new made-up title, which was above the senior wrangler. But despite that, she still was not able to receive a degree from the university. So it was only 5 years before Woolf's lectures that women had been able to receive degrees, and it had been a very contentious issue. So the very fact of a woman talking to women about the value of women's writing at a university which had only just begun sort of officially to recognise women as literary critics, in the field of English at least, that the very fact of having a woman talking to women about the value of women's writing was potentially a worrying thing, just as had the Bluestockings been in the 18th century, and I'll get onto them in a little bit more detail later. Virginia Woolf then wrote up these lectures that she'd given and published them in text form as A Room of One's Own on the 24th of October 1929. To some extent, the format of Virginia Woolf's original lectures, that is, pieces written for a live audience who were present in the room and listening hourly to Woolf's arguments, filters into the style of the published version, that is, published in text form intended for a distant, solitary reader. And the history of the development of the text is, I think, important to understanding a crucial part of Virginia Woolf's meaning. To begin, A Room of One's Own opens. But, you may say, we asked you to speak about women and fiction. What has that got to do with A Room of One's Own? What does this one sentence reveal to us about Virginia Woolf's purposes for the whole of her text? First, but is an unusual word to start a text with. Indeed, by its very nature, the beginning cannot be but, because but is a rebuttal of something that has gone before. There must be something before a but. So A Room of One's Own, then, opens almost mid-sentence and certainly mid-argument. The opening but signals a contradiction within an ongoing conversation. Woolf's text opens in media res, in the middle of the action, and in some sense that gives it a less settled feel than you might expect, because if something doesn't really have a sense of an opening, the implication is that it won't really have a sense of an ending either, that it won't really reach a definite conclusion. Because what if you get to the end and someone says, but, to that apparent ending? Another important thing that we notice in this opening sentence is the collective. So we've got a collective you, a plural you, and a we. This is a group of people being addressed. And if you were giving a lecture in a room full of people, then that makes sense. But the point is that it's continued into the printed format. So Woolf takes it into the printed textual format, this sense of the collective. It hasn't been amended, even though it's being produced for what one imagines will be a solitary, distant reader. That sense of the collective is still put front and centre in the very first sentence. Within A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf examines the ways in which women writers have battled a long history of exclusion, and the narrative voices perambulations around the long male-dominated University of Cambridge are marked by exclusion and prohibition for a woman. For example, later in the opening chapter, when the female narrative voice is not allowed entry to a college library because she's a woman, we're told, "Instantly there issued, like a guardian angel, barring the way with a flutter of black gown instead of white wings, a deprecating, silvery, kindly gentleman who regretted in a low voice as he waved me back that ladies are only admitted to the library if accompanied by a fellow of the college or furnished with a letter of introduction." Instead of the exclusion of the wider university, Woolf's lecture and subsequent text is marked by inclusion and mutual participation in the ongoing discussion. The opening of A Room of One's Own encourages a sense of the collective, a sense of women's collective participation, demonstrated by viewing the relationship between readers in the plural from the very opening, we. The third thing we notice from the opening sentence is that it is a question, a collective ask. And this establishes the idea of continuing dialogue and ongoing mutual engagement with each other, the speaker and the audience. The conversation is two-way rather than simply one way, from the speaker to the passive, acquiescing, accepting recipient. We are going to be asked, just as we are asking the initial question, we too are going to be asked to question what's being told to us and to think for ourselves. The form of the opening lines is in questioning mode, encouraging readers to adopt this mode too. We might compare this to other texts which are produced from lectures. So William Hazlitt's Lectures on the English Poets, for example. This is a famous set of lectures which, for example, John Keats attended and greatly inspired his poetry. And these, as it says on the title page, Hazlitt's lectures were delivered at the Surrey Institute. It's right there on the title page. These were lectures that were given in a public place. And yet, if we look at the beginning of lecture 1, so this is the same position as we're looking at the sentence in Woolf's A Room of One's Own, this is how Hazlitt's text begins. The best general notion I can give of poetry is that it is the natural impression of any object or circumstance by its vividness, exciting and involuntary movement of imagination and passion, and producing by sympathy a certain modulation of the sound of the voice or sounds expressing it. In treating of poetry, I shall speak first of the subject matter of it, next of the forms of expression to which it gives birth, and afterwards of its connection with harmony and sound. Now, Hazlitt is one of the premier critics, literary critics of the Romantic period. He writes very engagingly and vividly elsewhere. But in terms of pedagogy here, in terms of the mode that's being adopted, it's very traditional. The speaker has the piece of information and they are giving it to the passive listener. It opens the best general notion which I can give. So it's the I, speaker, giving the information to the listener. Very different from the opening of Woolf's essay. The sense of ongoing inquiry established in the first line of A Room of One's Own continues into the whole of the opening paragraph, which I'm going to look at now. But you may say, we asked you to speak about women in fiction. What has that got to do with a room of one's own? I will try to explain. Again, this is different from I will give you, which Hasse adopted. I will try to explain. When you asked me to speak about women in fiction, I sat down on the banks of a river and began to wonder what the words meant. They might mean a few remarks about Fanny Burney. Fanny Burney is the 18th century novelist who wrote, for example, Evelina. Really popular text. A few more about Jane Austen, a tribute to the Brontes, and a sketch of Haworth Parsonage under snow. Haworth Parsonage is where the Brontes lived. Some witticisms, if possible, about Miss Mitford. That's Mary Russell Mitford, who was a contemporary of Jane Austen's and knew her a little bit when they were young. A respectful allusion to George Eliot, a reference to Mrs. Gaskell, and one would have done. But. So we'll notice that, again, we're starting with but. So you might have thought that, but. At second sight, the words seem not so simple. The title Women and Fiction might mean, and you may have meant it to mean, women and what they are like. Or it might mean women and the fiction that they write. Or it might mean women and the fiction that is written about them. Or it might mean that somehow all three are inextricably mixed together, and you want me to consider them in that light. Here we've got a real sense of plurality, of a plurality of meanings, exploring the different possible meanings of things rather than answers. It might mean, it may mean, you might have meant this, it may have meant that, and offering up these different possibilities, these different potentials for exploration. But and again, we're beginning with another but. This idea of not quite settling, of saying something and then saying, but this, but that, encourages this idea of exploration, which was encouraged from the very opening sentence. But when I began to consider the subject in this last way, which seemed the most interesting, I soon saw that it had one fatal drawback. I should never be able to come to a conclusion. So again, we're back to the opening but. And never quite settling. It begins with that sense of not having settled, of ongoing discussion, and never being able to come to a conclusion. I should never be able to fulfill what is, I understand, the first duty of a lecturer. To hand you, after an hour's discourse, a nugget of pure truth, to wrap up between the pages of your notebooks and keep on the mantelpiece forever. And we might think of this as more the approach that Hazlitt took in his lectures. And Woolf here instead is choosing an ironic tone, that Woolf is explicitly rejecting the position of traditional lecturer, the traditional pedagogical approach, which is teacher knows best, pupil sits silently and accepts whatever teacher knows. It's not a case of exploring different possibilities, it's a case of being handed a pure nugget of truth that you keep kind of solidly forever, that doesn't change, that can't be thought about again, that you can't say but about. All I could do was offer you an opinion upon one minor point. A woman must have money and a room of her own. So the room of her own, that is the space and the peace and the quiet and the time to write, if she is to write fiction. And that, you will see, leaves a great problem of the true nature of woman and the true nature of fiction unsolved. I have shirked the duty of coming to a conclusion upon these two questions. Women and fiction remain, so far as I am concerned, unsolved problems. Part of the point of the whole essay is to say that that's okay. Things can remain unsolved problems, but you can explore them without coming to a conclusion. You can see the kind of ironic tone of shirked the duty of coming to a conclusion. The point is to open up discussion rather than to shut it down with a conclusion, because as soon as you have reached a conclusion, that's a kind of fixed, solid end point. People ought to be able to say but about conclusions. You ought to be able to continue the conversation rather than shutting everything down by deciding that a problem has been solved and you have come to a conclusion about it, a definite conclusion about it. Perhaps, if I lay bare the ideas and prejudices that lie behind this statement, you will find that they have some bearing upon women and some upon fiction. One can only give one's audience the chance of drawing their own conclusions as they observe the limitations, the prejudices, the idiosyncrasies of the speaker. And we're back to the opening sentence and the idea of the audience asking questions and drawing their own conclusions. It's a much more equal way of thinking about exploration and learning and seeking knowledge. It is for you to seek out this truth and to decide whether any part of it is worth keeping. If not, you will of course throw the whole thing into the wastepaper basket and forget all about it. Virginia Woolf thus advocates for a different way of thinking about learning. That is not the usual status-bound hierarchical method of teacher-pupil in which teacher knows best and pupil unquestioningly imbibes teacher's knowledge and assertions, but one in which the supposed teacher self-confessedly does not know the answers and leaves it for the supposed pupil to work out what they think. And for some, especially conventional, dusty old hidebound fellows of various male colleges, this is a worrying status quo breaking form of pedagogy, form of teaching, because it's questioning authority, it's questioning traditional modes of authority, and equally in terms of English literature, questioning the idea of canonicity, because we're supposed to have been told that certain texts are the important texts, those texts are part of the canon, and those are the ones that we should be looking at. So generally speaking, that's Chaucer, Spenser, Shakespeare, Milton, Pope, Wordsworth, Tennyson. Those are the important authors that you are supposed to form your idea of literary history around. What Virginia Woolf establishes in the opening sentence remains important for her argument throughout the main body of A Room of One's Own. That is, having an ongoing conversation and a resistance of the stasis of the status quo, and a sense of community, plurality rather than singularity. And we see this echoed later in perhaps one of the most famous passages of A Room of One's Own, where Virginia Woolf describes the collective all women together. Woolf emphasises how important women talking together has been, and indeed continues to be, in the development of ideas about women's writing, as well as the development of women's writing itself. And this is from chapter 4. The extreme activity of mind which showed itself in the later 18th century among women, the talking and the meeting. And you can see here how she's tried to keep that tone, talking and meeting. These were originally given as lectures, keeping that sense of this being about women coming together. We are asking you, you are listening to us. That sense of a kind of salon, as it was called in the 18th century. So the talking and the meeting, the writing of essays on Shakespeare, and that's particularly in reference to Elizabeth Montagu, who was a bluestocking. She's there on the right, and she published an essay on the writings and genius of Shakespeare in 1769, a very popular text that was well received at the time, and the translating of the classics. We might think of the classicist Elizabeth Carter, who was another bluestocking, who in 1758 produced one of the first English translations of the discourses of Epictetus, and he was a Greek Stoic philosopher. Also another very well received popular text of the 18th century, was founded on the solid fact that women could make money by writing. Money dignifies what is frivolous if unpaid for. It might still be well to sneer at bluestockings with an itch for scribbling, but it could not be denied that they could put money in their purses. One of the standard ways to dismiss women's writing in the 18th century was just to refer to it as mere scribbling, and Woolf's invoking that here, bluestockings with an itch for scribbling. The bluestockings were a much maligned group of educated women. Well, they started off being men and women, but during the course of the 18th century gradually became much more focused on women and women's writing and women's salons. So they were a much maligned group of educated women who in the 18th century gathered to talk about literature. Really, we can think of them as the first women's literary discussion group. And the primary criticism of them was shock horror that they were unfeminine and that they were masculine. And you can see from this cartoon here by Thomas Rowlandson from 1815 how unsettling the bluestockings were seen to be, that they were disrupting the proper order, that they were creating anarchy. Letting women kind of out of their proper domestic sphere would lead to disruption of order and anarchy. Blue-stocking women were seen as intruding into the sphere that ought to belong to men and likely to neglect their proper domestic duties. So you don't want women reading because then they won't be doing the laundry or they won't be cooking supper or whatever. Back to Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. Thus, towards the end of the 18th century, a change came about which, if I were rewriting history, I should describe more fully and think of greater importance than the Crusades or the Wars of the Roses. I discuss in another video of mine the feminist credentials of the idea of rewriting history, as Woolf's narrative voice sets out to do in A Room of One's Own, and how unsettling it can be for those who wish to maintain the traditional gender hierarchies. In the other video, I discuss the way that Jane Austen, in her novel Northanger Abbey, counters and lambasts traditional accounts of history when Catherine Morland, the naive heroine of Northanger Abbey, although she says sometimes more sharp, pointed things than her naive guise suggests, Catherine Morland declares, I read it a little as a duty, but it tells me nothing that does not either vex or weary me. The quarrels of popes and kings with wars or pestilences in every page, the men also good for nothing, and hardly any women at all. It is very tiresome. And no doubt the lack of women in history was still tiresome for Woolf a century later. Woolf makes a similar challenge as Austen had made when she offers up what she considers to be of greater importance to history than various wars. So what is more important to national history than these various wars? It is that women began to write. The middle-class woman began to write. This is more important in terms of the national history than various wars and pestilences, etc. Middle-class women began to write. For if Pride and Prejudice, that's by Jane Austen, matters, and Middlemarch, George Eliot, and Villette, Charlotte Bronte, and Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte, matter, then it matters far more than I can prove in an hour's discourse that women generally, and not merely the lonely aristocrat shut up in her country house among her folios and her flatterers, took to writing. This is the idea that women's writing has not been and should not be individualistic and isolated, but communal and connected. And we're back again to this we in the opening sentence, that sense of community. Without those forerunners, Jane Austen and the Brontes and George Eliot could no more have written than Shakespeare could have written without Marlowe, or Marlowe without Chaucer, or Chaucer without those forgotten poets who paved the way and tamed the natural savagery of the tongue. For masterpieces are not single and solitary births. I think there's a really interesting use of gendered imagery here, the idea of childbirth. They are the outcome of many years of thinking in common, of thinking by the body of people, so that the experience of the mass is behind a single voice. Jane Austen should have laid a wreath upon the grave of Fanny Burney, and George Eliot done homage to the robust shade of Eliza Carter. That's Elizabeth Carter, the classicist that I was mentioning earlier. The valiant old woman who tied a bell to her bedstead in order that she might wake early and learn Greek. All women together ought to let flowers fall upon the tomb of Aphra Behn, which is most scandalously but rather appropriately in Westminster Abbey, for it was she who earned them the right to speak their minds. Aphra Behn is often thought of as the first professional woman writer because she made money by her pen. She was a playwright in the Restoration period, so that's the late 17th century, and she earned enough money by writing to provide for herself. So it was her profession. She was a professional woman writer. Jane Austen, for example, did not make enough money in her lifetime to actually live by her pen. Aphra Behn did. Just as in the opening sentence of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own then, the main body of the text likewise argues for a sense of collective, of all women together, to continue ongoing discussions. Masterpieces are the outcome of many years of thinking in common, of questioning in common, of the mass experience behind a single voice, and most importantly, the importance of the challenge of but. Thank you so much for listening. I do hope you found what I've had to say illuminating. Please remember to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and do leave any thoughts or any questions or any comments that you have below. I really do love hearing from you.